Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending this course. This is going to be easy little basic beginner's course. The state of Kansas has this book. We call it our quick guide. It's a little 5x7 book with a spiral binding. If you don't have a paper copy of this book, work with Cheyenne to get a copy mailed to you. If you can also download this book off of our DWR website. Just do a Google search for it. It's pretty easy. If you can't find it, I can send you a link to it. And you can send me a quick email. My email and contact information will be in one of the slides coming up, although about half the people on this call already know my email. Some of you may have worked with Cheyenne to get enrolled for the class today. Cheyenne is taking the CFM exam this morning. So the next time you hear from Cheyenne, hopefully she'll have some alphabet to put behind her name. Now, this quick guide book is common. A lot of states have a book like this. And so I want to give credit to some states like Missouri and Illinois that shared some of their information from their quick guide with us here in Kansas. We based some information off that. So we stole shamelessly from other states, but we also created new content and some states stole from us. Okay, sorry about that. So let's just jump into it. So floodplain management all began in 1968 for all of us because that's when the National Flood Insurance Program began. And I'm going to say NFIP a lot today, and that's what it stands for, National Flood Insurance Program. Like I said, this is a beginner level class to teach you the acronyms and everything. You'll notice on this slide that I've underlined the word voluntary. So voluntary in federal government terms means that a community can volunteer not to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. A city or county does not have to participate in the NFIP. But if they don't participate, then the government says you can't have flood insurance in your community from the federal government, and you can't have federally backed loans because federally backed loans in the floodplain require flood insurance. Now, you could still get federally backed loans in areas outside the floodplain. Can't have disaster assistance. But one of the big ones is you can't get any other federal program type grants. So I've got communities that didn't join the flood program for many years, and they applied for a CDBG grant, Community Development Block Grant, usually for water lines or something like that. Well, if you're running water lines all over town and you've got floodplain in town, sooner or later you're going to have a water line running through a floodplain zone. And those communities were being denied. Their grants were being held up. And so they called me and they said, Steve, we need to join the flood program this afternoon. Well, it doesn't happen quite that fast, but we did get them in. And so I always recommend to communities that aren't in the program, you need to get in before something like that happens. And then by being in, you've made the program available to your citizens and they can buy flood insurance if they choose to. So voluntary means if you voluntarily say no to the flood program, you're saying no to all of the other federal programs tied to it that you may need. In this flood program, it's like a lot of professions. It has its own language. BFE is one of the most common ones, and it means base flood elevation. And you'll hear me say BFE a lot when you're talking to me on the phone. You'll see it in emails that I send you. But we have to always remember that the citizens we work with, the community officials that we work with, people outside of floodplain management, don't understand all these acronyms. And so if I say BFE to the mayor of some small town, he is not going to know what I'm talking about. So we always have to remember to explain these things. But BFE stands for base flood elevation. But then again, what does base flood elevation mean? It's how high the water is going to be in a flood that has a 1 out of 100 chance of happening in any given year. They call it the 1% chance flood. EC is for elevation certificate, which is a form you fill out to verify that a building is elevated correctly and certified by a surveyor. A LOMA is a letter map amendment. That is a document from FEMA that says by this letter we are amending or changing our flood map so that the described property, it's usually a street address, is not considered to be in the floodplain anymore. Sometimes those LOMAs are for meets and bounds description, sometimes they're just for the house itself. Now, I'm not going to go through every acronym on this page, most of you can read, but those top three, BFE, LOMA, EC, those are the ones that I use the most. And if you deal with a lot of citizens like I do, you probably are going to use those same terms quite a bit yourself. So BFE stands for base flood. What is the base flood? Okay, so the base flood is the flood that has the 1% chance of happening each and any year. Now, people will pull out several words from that long sentence I just gave you and pull out the 100 and the year and the flood, and they'll call it a 100-year flood. But I really don't like that term, because when you say 100-year flood, people think of a timeline with year 1, year 2, year 3, and so on up to year 100. And they think that this flood is only going to happen once every century. And I've had people who mistakenly thought they were safe because they had already had a flood. So they didn't think another one was going to happen for 100 years, and they didn't need to buy flood insurance. In fact, I once had a man tell me that he had had 3 100-year floods already, and he was safe for the next 100 years or 300 years. Well, he kind of like proved his own argument was wrong. So I call it the 1% chance flood. I hope that's what all of you will do. Even though 100-year flood rolls right off the tongue, and you'll even see it in FEMA documents, the 1% chance flood is a way of conveying this as a statistical risk issue. Now, why do they call it the base flood? Because it's the flood that insurance and rules and regulations and flood maps are based upon. So it's the size of the flood that is the basis for all these other things. That's why they call it the base flood. They also called it the regulatory flood because that's the flood level that rules and regulations are based upon. Here in the state of Kansas, we elevate buildings 1 foot above the base flood elevation, or we regulate to that level and add 1 foot. Hope everybody understands that. I don't like to say 100-year flood is if they have a tornado, for example. Well, they might say it's an EF5 tornado. When they have a hurricane, they say, oh, it's a category 1 or category 2 or category 3 tornado or a hurricane. So these other things, they don't call them the 100-year hurricane or the 200-year tornado. They have a different way of categorizing them. And if they did that same type of categorization for flooding, there'd be less confusion about it. Nobody ever crawled out from underneath their house after it was destroyed by a tornado and said, well, that was the 100-year tornado. I can cancel my homeowner's insurance for the next 99 years. Now, we've been talking about a base flood, a 1% chance flood. So this is kind of how it's mapped out. Imagine if you took a bulldozer and just made a straight line across a stream channel and put a sheet of glass up against it. This is sort of a cutaway view of a stream channel. Now, here in the center, you've kind of got that little low spot with the little water line symbol on it. That's your creek bed. That's your embankments. Then on either side, the land starts to slope out a little bit. Quite often here in Kansas, that place where it slopes out could be quite wide and much shallower of a slope than what is shown here. Nevertheless, that area is the area where it's been carved out by Mother Nature with past floods. And so that's essentially your floodplain. Then it connects to high ground on either side of the floodplain. We calculate flood elevations. Tara is a very good flood mapper. We calculate flood elevations. How high is the water predicted to be? Then we use topographic information to figure out where that water level intersects with the ground. And then we create a flood map based off of what's going to be below that water level in that area. So in this picture, we've got the high ground shown on either side. In the center, closest to the stream channel, we have an area marked as the floodway. Outside the floodway, I have an area called the flood fringe. This is typical of an AE zone on a flood map. There are also unnumbered A zones where we would just say the entire area from one side to the other is the special flood hazard area, but there would be no floodway designed. Talk about that some more in a minute. Now, I've been talking about floodways, so let's look at a floodway here real quick. All right, now, so the floodway imagines that you wanted to build a house and you want to elevate it above the flood level. So you bring in some dirt and you make a pad of dirt and you build your house on top of that pad of dirt. Okay, that's legal to do. If we were to do that on both sides of the stream channel, the water in the center is going to get squeezed. And as we squeeze it, it rises. And at the point where that water level rises 1 foot, they say stop the calculations. They mark that on the map and they say this area here with this 1 foot of rise is the floodway. And anything you do in the floodway in the future would mess up our calculations. So we can't do anything in the floodway without a certification by an engineer that says it will not cause a rise. So this is kind of how it's done in theory. Now, this is a nice little diagram of a stream that's got equal amounts of fill on both sides. We do have some streams where you'll have a high side and a low side. And so the fill will be primarily all on one side and not so much on the other. But this is a good way to depict it. Just remember, you you start pushing the water in from either side by putting development in the floodplain. When you get to the point where the water level rises 1 foot, they mark that, call that the floodway. That's basically how that's determined. So each of you here today on this call represents a community, and your community is in the National Flood Insurance Program. And your community has responsibilities under this program. So in order to be in the National Flood Insurance Program, your communities have to adopt an ordinance. And some of you are county officials and you adopt resolutions. Some of you don't have an ordinance with your floodplain regulations. Maybe you have a city code or zoning section that has a floodplain district in it. For the rest of the day, I'm just going to say ordinance over and over again. If you're a county person, you just mentally think in your head, Steve means resolution for me. All right. So you adopt an ordinance. An ordinance is going to have all of your floodplain regulations inside of it, what you're supposed to do. So it may say you have to issue permits. That's the second bullet point on the list, you see? So your ordinance is kind of the overruling thing that you as floodplain managers need to read. I hope each and every person on this call has read their floodplain management ordinance. Again, I'm not going to read every bullet point on this slide to you, but I'm going to pick out a couple of key ones. Require elevation certificates to document compliance. That's mandatory for certain types of buildings. It's not required if somebody wants to build a big giant brick barbecue in the backyard of their house. And yes, a barbecue like that would have to have a floodplain permit. Would a sidewalk need a floodplain permit? It doesn't stick up above the ground. And the answer is yes, it does. It says on that second bullet point, require floodplain development permits. If you read your floodplain regulations, look up the definition of the word development. Development means any man-made change to improved or unimproved real estate. So is a sidewalk a man-made change? Yes, it is. Is it in the floodplain? Yes, it is. Does it require a permit? Yes, it does. Is that a difficult permit to issue? No, that is almost pencil whipping out a form, having somebody signing it, and you're done. But still in all, we have to issue these permits so that we can prove to FEMA that we're keeping track of what's going on in the floodplains in our towns, and that you all as floodplain managers know everything that's going on in the floodplain. And if you do permits for the little stuff, doing permits for the big stuff gets a lot easier. Now, this is an older view of a map legend. We still have about, there's quite a few areas that are still using paper maps. And they look a little bit like the paper highway maps that Z fold up. And when you fold up an old paper flood map, this is the part that is left sticking up at the top. And I call this the map legend. It's a good example. And if you see newer flood maps, you'll see the map legend on those, but it's not all white and black like this. And this kind is easy to find certain things on it. So the map will tell you that this is at the top a flood insurance rate map, a FIRM. The FIRM is a flood insurance rate map. It's a type of map. It's not an exercise program. It'll tell you the name of the community, and the community is Dickinson County. And if you look, it says this map contains community, City of Solomon, and the unincorporated county. Next to that has the community number. The community number is used on a lot of FEMA forms that you have to fill out, like elevation certificates. And it also has the map and panel number. Now, if you ever fill out a FEMA form and it asks you for the map number or panel number, don't get fooled by where it says panel 61 of 220 about halfway down. Go to the bottom where it says map number and it's 20041C0061. That's your full map number. C is the revision number. Again, I'm not going to read everything to you, but you can see for this, if you look at this checklist on the side, all this information is on the map legend. Now, if you open up one of those older style maps, it's kind of a black and white image, but the black and white images make things easier to see. So here's one of them. And Tara's on the line today. She can tell you there are still communities using these old paper flood maps here in the state of Kansas. On this map legend, you can see we have Zone AE. That's an area with elevations. That's where you have floodways. And our floodways are the areas shown with the diagonal striping. And then you can see hexagons with letters in them. Those are called cross sections. In each one of those cross sections, there's a book called A Flood Insurance Study. And in that book, you can find at that cross section a lot of good information like the water depth and the velocity and things like that. If we were to put all of the depths and velocities and all of that other kind of information on the map itself, the map would be really jumbled up. It would be difficult to read. So we put this other information in a book separate from it. You can see a zone X with a blue arrow pointed to it. There's two of them. one in the upper right. The one in the upper right is shaded. They call it shaded Zone X. On some of the older flood maps, it's called Zone B. Down in the lower left, there's a Zone X that's on the white background. That's called an unshaded Zone X. That used to be called Zone C in some of the older flood maps, and I'm bringing it up in case anybody here has one of these older flood maps. Excuse me a second. All right, here's a slightly newer type of flood map. This is the kind we were making in the early part of this century. And it's got these little blue dots on it, and the blue dots designate the floodplain. And then around the edge of the blue dots, you can see some black dots. Right there by cross section A, you'll see some. Those black dots are the same as that shaded Zone X that I was just talking to you about. So the black dots are shaded Zone X, the blue dots are Zone AE. Now, sometimes you have an area that doesn't have a floodway or elevations on the map. And if you look at the upper right-hand side, you'll see Zone A. You'll notice the floodway stops. It doesn't continue. Zone A is an area, it's a high-risk area, same as Zone AE, but it doesn't have those elevations on it and doesn't have a floodway. This is a newer style map, but it's not the latest and greatest. And here's what the maps look like today. And, they have different color schemes on them, and they're set up a little bit differently, but these are easier for colorblind people to read. And so the Americans with Disabilities Act requires that our flood maps comply with these requirements for people with disabilities, and color blindness is a disability. But here, our floodway is shown, and it says floodway Zone AE in the upper center portion of the screen, and it's got red stripes. So no matter which flood map you're looking at, your floodway areas are shown by diagonal striping. On that white and black scale map that was, let me go back 2 slides. See, it's these diagonal stripes that go right through cross sections AA, AB, AC, Z at the top. Then we go to this next map, and here the diagonal stripes are a whitish color, but it's still striped through the area with the floodway. The number 4 is pointing to it. Then you go over here to this map, and the diagonal stripes are red. But floodways are shown with diagonal striping in Zone AEs with cross sections. And in this map, you'll also see some numbers. Right near the place where it says City of Wichita, there's a cross section J, and it says 1289.5 feet in the middle of cross section J. That's the predicted base flood elevation. The BFE is 1289.5 right there in that spot. Now, if you look downstream of this, you'll also see a number that says 1289, and it has a little squiggly line. Wherever those little squiggly lines are, your elevation numbers are rounded off to the whole foot. They might be rounded up, they might be rounded down. I never use those little squiggly line numbers, because if it's a rounded down number and I use it, you could actually be building something too low. So always take the time to get the flood insurance study book out, look at the cross sections in the flood profiles, and calculate an exact base flood elevation. And now that I've opened that door, I better show you a cross section of a flood profile from the flood insurance study book, hadn't I? All right, so this is a profile in the flood insurance study book. They generally run like this, and they show the water flowing downhill. You've got high ground on the right, lower ground on the left, and we've got 4 lines on there. And the top line is the 0.2% chance flood. The second line from the top is the 1% annual chance flood. And did you notice that in this map legend, it says 100-year flood on this FEMA document? Told you not to use that term, but I did warn you that you'll see it on some FEMA documents. A 1% chance flood is the line we regulate to. So if you were looking at your flood map and you saw cross section E downstream of your property, and you saw cross section F upstream of your property, and your property was somewhere between cross section E and F, you would get out a ruler or a scale, use the scaling on the map, and follow the stream channel to measure the distance cross downstream from one and upstream from the other, and you'd make a ratio. Then you come back to this book, open up this page of the profile of the stream channel, and you'd make a similar ratio there. Then you would measure up to where you find your 1% chance flood line. Take that straight across to point number 2 over there at the left. And on the left-hand side of this profile table, you can see numbers like 1300, 1310, 1320. Each of those is a flood elevation. And you'll notice that they're 10 feet apart and that there's 10 boxes between each of those numbers. Each one of those little boxes represents 1 foot of elevation. So our base foot elevation that we would calculate for this case example would be at 1,323 feet. Now, these little boxes, when you see them in real life, are like 1/8 of an inch high. And if your pencil lead's not very sharp, it's going to account for 2 or 3 inches by itself. This is where some judgment calls get into it. This is a basic level class, but we actually have a more in-depth class where we go through a flood insurance study profile and give a case example in class. This is an older method of doing base flood elevations in areas where you have zone A only on the flood map and nothing to go by to determine the elevations. And yes, I had to do this when I worked for the county that I was in. So here you've got a road. And where that road comes down, if you look at the road in the middle of the screen there, where it crosses through the floodplain, you'll see that the road has a little of a bump out where it's not a straight line. It kind of bumps over to the right a little bit. Then you go over to the topographic map and you will see below where it says oil wells, follow the road down and you will see that it has that same bump out. You'll also see contour elevation lines on this USGS quad map. And you'll notice that the elevation lines and that road bump out have a point where they intersect pretty closely and line up very closely with the floodplain. So you could probably deduce that your base flood elevation is the same number as whatever that elevation line is on that contour line on that USGS quad map. However, the rule is that if you do this method, it's an approximated method and you would have to add half a contour. And all USGS quad maps have contours on them that are 10 feet apart. Adding half a contour is 5 feet. So now I'd be having to elevate my building 5 extra feet in the air. So that's not really the way we want to do it. I had to do it twice at my previous job, but nowadays we've got much better ways of doing things, and that's good old Bill Pace in the base flood elevation portal. If you don't know Bill Pace, you better get to know him. If you're not signed up for the base flood elevation portal, you better get signed up. Now, I've been talking about zones A and AE a lot today. Let's look at all the flood zones. Zone A and AE I've talked about. Zone AO and AH are areas of shallow flooding. We don't have any zone ARs in Kansas, so I'm going to kind of skip that. BC and X zones are zones of either low risk or moderate risk. You notice there are no zero risk floodplains. Zone D, we don't have any of them in Kansas right now. FEMA has talked to us once or twice about putting zone Ds in areas behind levees, but it hadn't happened yet. Different types of letters and map revision. I talked about LOMAs in the beginning, but a LOMA is basically saying that the ground around the house is higher than the floodwater is predicted to reach. Therefore, the floodwater can never reach the house. FEMA, please issue a letter stating that the house should not be in the floodplain, even though the map shows it is. FEMA won't redraw the map itself. They'll issue a letter. The letter's attached to the map stating that the letter's amended. A LOMA is just a larger version of that, where we're not trying to just get one house out. We might be trying to redraw the flood map entirely for a new subdivision all built on fill or a stream channel that's been rerouted. LOMA F is where they bring in fill dirt to raise the ground. Since it's not natural ground that they're raising on, it's on fill dirt, they call it LOMA F. Physical map revisions are usually associated with levees that were not incorporated in the previous map. And LOMA out is shown is where a building is outside the floodplain when you have a good GIS system that can show it. And you would say, hey, look, even though there's floodplain in the backyard, my house isn't in, so please issue a LOMA out as shown for my house. I'm oversimplifying this a little bit, but this is a beginner's level class. Now, a LOMA, letter map amendment, is naturally occurring ground. That's the picture on the left. If it's a LOMA F, it's on fill. That's the picture on the right. Both houses are elevated almost the exact same way. Both houses look very much alike. They're both at the same level. but one sits on naturally occurring ground and one sits on ground that's been altered by bringing in fill dirt. There are slight differences in the way that FEMA reviews letters of map revision on fill instead of letters of map amendment. With letters of map amendment, FEMA would say, our map was wrong. We just made a miscalculation. This house shouldn't have been in the floodplain to begin with. With letters of map revision on fill, FEMA saying our map was correct and you tried to alter the conditions, and that's fine, but we're going to do a slightly different type of review, a little bit stricter than we do with regular LOMA. And we have a full course on LOMAs and LOMAR Fs. It's on our training website. You can listen to a recording of it. Now, I mentioned that Zone D sometimes is associated with levees and that PMRs are also associated with levees. So let's talk about levees for a minute. If your community has a levee, and I know there are some communities on this phone call or a seminar today that have levees in their town, levees to be shown as protecting a community on the flood map have to be certified. And so what does certification mean? Well, there's actually a Code of Federal Regulations, a CFR, section that says how to certify a levee. And there are basically 10 key points. We've got 8 of them lined up here on the page. The two that a lot of our communities have the most problem with, one is freeboard. The levee has to be tall enough. And it doesn't have to be just tall enough to hold back the base flood elevation. It has to be 3 foot higher than that. And there are also rules for roads and enclosures and things like that. So it's not just that. But that's a big one that a lot of communities have issues with, because if their levee's not tall enough, it's just simply hard to certify their levee. And what does certification mean? Well, certification means that an engineer, independent of FEMA, comes out and verifies that levee is certified. Now, I've had communities that had their levee in a program where the Corps of Engineers came out and inspected their levees once a year. So they assumed that the Corps of Engineers had certified their levee, but it was not certified by the Corps. The Corps was only inspecting it for rodent damage, trees growing on it, that sort of things. And as long as the community maintains their levee, it's eligible in a Corps program to get funding to help pay for repairs if it's ever destroyed or damaged in a flood. That's not the same thing as being certified. If you have questions about levee certification, get with me later. Now, I talked about your ordinance and we talked about issuing permits. Here's a list of things that require permits under that definition of development. Again, I'm not going to read the whole list to you. I know everybody on this call can read, even people from other states. So I'm going to look on about the 5th bullet point. See where it says temporary buildings and accessories? I can't tell you how many times I've had a citizen tell me and argue with me that he didn't need a floodplain permit because what he was doing was only temporary. There is no allowance in your floodplain regulations that says temporary buildings are exempt from permits. You know those little homes, they were all big in the TV and news for a while. People were building these tiny houses. The people who built the tiny houses would tell me, well, my house is a tiny house, so it's exempt from all the rules. No, it's not exempt from floodplain regulations. I'm sorry to tell you. And sometimes they bring in those tiny houses on trailers. And so they'll say, well, they moved it in here and we can move it out. So it's only temporary and it's exempt from floodplain rules. I've heard that time and again. So I'm just wanting to stress this because we've had a lot of issues with that. Ag buildings require permits. There's actually a state statute that says agriculture buildings are exempt from local zoning and building codes unless they're in the floodplain. And I've had farmers recite that statute to me, except they always leave off the part about except in the floodplain when they recite it to me. So I've had a lot of farmers tell me that their buildings are exempt from regulations by state law, and I've had to set them straight. So if you have any questions about what's going on in your floodplain in your town and what requires a permit or not, call me. Err on the side of caution. You need to keep an eye on your floodplain, know where it is, know how to read your flood maps, and don't let anything happen in your floodplain without checking to see if it needs a permit or not. And if you're not sure, call me. But if you look at this list right here, you're going to see that just about anything that happens in the floodplain has to have a permit.
So Steve, sorry to interrupt you, but there was a question about if a mobile home is exempt, and I think that there was an answer there that they're not.
Mobile homes are not exempt. So a mobile home, some people say, well, it's temporary. But if you look, bullet point number 3, placing manufactured homes. And if you read your floodplain regulations, it'll say flat out in your floodplain regulations the requirements for mobile homes. And FEMA has a book. It's P85 and its requirements for manufactured homes and mobile homes in the floodplain. And so no, they're not exempt. And if a mobile home washes away in a flood, somebody's lost a house, somebody might lose their life. So mobile homes and manufactured homes have to be anchored down so they won't float away, and they have to be elevated above the flood level. And we actually have a slide coming up here shortly that's going to show a picture of a mobile home. It's just a sketch, but it'll make the point when I get to it.
And there's another question about wastewater systems and what are the recommendations and requirements?
Well, it sort of depends on the type of wastewater system we're talking about. So if you're talking about a city lagoon cell, the basic issue is to have the berm around the outside of the cell elevated to a level higher than the base flood elevation, so that what's inside the lagoon cell will not get out and contaminate the flood water, which is already dirty enough, and the flood water won't get inside the lagoon cell. A similar rule would apply to your lagoon cell for like your simple, the lagoon behind a one house, the single type unit. But then we've also got septic tanks. So maybe you're talking about septic tanks. And so septic tanks are buried underground, but you would have to have a backflow preventer to keep water from backing up into the house when the groundwater rises during a flood and everything is saturated. And you'll need to have that tank anchored in the ground such a way that the tank won't float up out of the soil. And you'll say, oh, that'll never happen. And I'm here to tell you, I've seen it happen. Okay, so I mean, it's a great big concrete tank in the ground, but I've actually seen these float up out of the ground before. Seen swimming pools float up out of the ground. Okay, I'm going to move on and not go too far in the weeds about that, but whoever asks that question can give me a call when this class is over and tell me about a specific case, and I'll give them more details. All right, there's pictures of some subdivisions in the floodplain, and it says recommended. So there is no hard and fast rule from FEMA that says you can't have subdivisions in the floodplain. But when you're drawing out your subdivision lots, I want you to look at these three pictures. So in picture number one, the little black boxes that represent the houses, the two houses to the north, the upper part, are not in the floodplain, but they're just barely not in the floodplain. And I can tell you right now that a bank making a bank loan on these houses would 9 times out of 10 require flood insurance as being mandatory for them. And they would almost have to do a survey and have a LOMA done to prove they don't require flood insurance, especially the one that looks like it's almost but not quite touching the floodplain. That one is so close that a survey would just about be mandatory. And if you had your subdivision plans laid out like this and you've plotted it all out, and the contractor goes out there and pours the foundation a few feet too far to the north by accident because they didn't measure it out before they put the foundation in, and gets it slightly in the wrong spot, bingo, you're going to have a house in the floodplain. The bottom one, where it says not recommended, it's not recommended, but it is allowed. You could do it, but the two houses that are smack dab in the gray area, the floodplain area, would just have to be elevated above the base flood elevation. The picture at the upper right has the lot lines as being smaller so that none of the actual lot lines touches the floodplain. It means the houses are on smaller lots, but they squeeze the same number of houses in there, but they're all closer together. The advantage for that is that none of the lots have any floodplain on them. And Tara can tell you that we get a lot of questions from property owners about, well, the floodplain is touching our lot or it's in our backyard. Is our house in the floodplain? Another thing that happens with a subdivision like this is that they can deed out that area that's in the floodplain within the subdivision that's not on anybody's parcel list, maybe some sort of deed restricted area or an open space area as a covenant for setting up the subdivision. That gets into zoning. We're not gonna go too far down that road, but just try to design improvements and build things so that we stay out of the floodplain as much as we can. That's the key point here. Now we have older houses in Kansas that are built in the floodplain, and they got built years ago before floodplains existed. And there was a law that was passed. It was passed after a hurricane in 1973, but it didn't go into effect until 1974. And this law said that any homes that were built prior to December 31st, 1974 are called pre-firm. They pre-existed prior to a flood insurance rate map. Any of them that were built after that are called post-firm, except that December 31st, 1974 deadline is different in different communities. In some communities, that deadline is tied to the date of their first flood insurance rate map. Now in Topeka, Topeka got their first flood insurance rate map in 1971, actually. Well, their deadline is still 1974 because their flood map was prior to that law. So their deadline is December 31st, 1974. But I've got other communities that didn't get flood insurance rate maps until like 1986. As a matter of fact, Tara's working with some communities to do mapping projects right now that still don't have their first flood insurance rate map, and she's working hard to give them one. So their flood insurance rate map is going to be dated sometime in 2022 when she gets their new map created. So post-firm houses built after flood map exists, pre-firm houses built before flood map exists. Pre-firm houses, certain things are grandfathered in, they can remain as they are until they're demolished or substantially damaged. Post-firm houses, in theory, should have been built in compliance with the flood maps that existed at the time they were constructed, and hopefully they're elevated. Now here's a little picture of a house that has some, I'm going to call them mitigation techniques. These are some techniques that are used to reduce damage from flooding. So in this picture, you can see that there's a concrete flood wall. We call them knee walls because a lot of times these things are about knee high. We also, if you look, you can see a backflow preventer on the sewer line. Again, if you had this connected to a septic tank, like we talked about earlier, that would keep water from backing up into the house. Then over there on the left, you can see a small berm. And this is what a lot of farmers and people I talk to want to do. They want to put a berm in their yard and then have FEMA issue a letter stating they're out of the floodplain. And that just doesn't work because levees, if you remember the picture of the levee, have to be certified and they have to be 3 foot higher than the water's predicted to reach. So if you put in a little hump in the ground that's 2 foot high, that's not going to change the flood map at all. It would take filing a LOMAR and having that hump in the ground certified exactly like the levees in New Orleans for Hurricane Katrina, or the levees in Coffeyville and Augusta and El Dorado. Now, there is a house in Erie, Kansas that has one of these little humps going around it like that, like a little donut ring. And it's sloped and you just drive your car up over the hump like a big kind of a big gentle speed bump when you're pulling into the yard. And in 2007, that house got flooded. And in 2007, they got a new owner who bought that house about a month before the flood happened. This is a true story. Blonde people from California. I met them at a meeting. They had bought this house, and the banker told them, "You don't need flood insurance because you've got that little hump built around your house to keep the flood water out." Well, the flood water was just a few inches higher than that little hump, and that whole house flooded. And you know who was there the next day to help them clean up and get their furniture packed up? That was the banker who had told him not to buy flood insurance. He was Johnny on the spot the next morning. Now, you have to issue permits, right? For anything in the floodplain. And you want to make sure that your permits are done correctly. So here's some permit review steps. Big one here is contact DWR at 785-564-6650. That's not my phone number. That's going to ring in Manhattan, Kansas. And that's going to ring for the Water Structures Program for Division of Water Resources. So we have a team of engineers that are required to issue floodplain fill permits and levee permits and dam permits. And a lot of those requirements go back to state laws that were passed as long ago as 1929. Now, those state laws were passed before the National Flood Insurance Program ever existed. And although there are some things in that program that cross over with the National Flood Insurance Program, there are things that are different. If you have somebody doing something in a floodplain fill is common for a LOMAR F. They're probably 9 times out of 10 going to have to get a state permit also. But there might be some other cases where you call in and say, no, that one's not going to need a permit because it's not a jurisdictional stream. The drainage is too small for us to require a permit. How do you know these things? The best way to know is to call and ask, because you don't want to be the guy or the lady who issues a permit for somebody and they build something, and when they get it all done, you find out it was in the floodplain all along and should have had a permit from the state. I can show you a carport that used to be a garage. It's in a town where the city clerk issued a floodplain development permit for somebody to build a garage. Well, he built that garage and it was in the floodway and nobody checked with the state. And the state made them tear the walls off that garage and convert it to a carport so it wouldn't cause a rise in the floodway. And then they charged them double the fees for doing that because it was an after the fact permit. Endangered Species Act. We haven't heard a lot about this yet, but there are lawsuits against FEMA. And FEMA is saying that, hey, don't sue us. it's the cities and counties' fault. They're letting people build in the floodplain without verifying endangered species. So FEMA's answer to the lawsuits is to say it's all basically the fault of us, the people on this call, me, you, all of us. FEMA's saying it's everybody's fault but theirs, because FEMA was approving LOMARs and LOMAR Fs for properties in the floodplain without verifying endangered species. And so they said it's the community's fault. So FEMA is going to be requiring communities in Kansas and all over the country to verify endangered species before we approve permits. That may seem silly if somebody's putting a shed in the backyard in the middle of town. Nevertheless, that's something that we're going to see happening. FEMA says they're going to issue guidance on this. That guidance is coming out in November of 2019. What year is it now? Okay, it's not 2019 anymore. We still don't have that guidance. But FEMA's beating me up about endangered species all the time, even though they haven't issued guidance. And the guidance is going to say what kind of documentation FEMA demands to see. My advice to you is verify Endangered Species Act for every permit you issue. And we have a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service office in Manhattan that can help you do it. If you listen to a recording of our LOMA and LOMAR F class, we have about 15 minutes where we talk about endangered species and how to verify that. But this is our basic level class. This is the Reader's Digest version, so I'm moving on. Floodplain records should be maintained permanently. I can't tell you how many times people have kept floodplain permits for 3 or 4 years and then assumed they didn't need them anymore and then threw them out. Then the house got sold and the new owner came in and said, I need a copy of the elevation certificate to give to my insurance agent. Nobody had one anymore. There was a community we did an audit in, and the city manager was the floodplain manager. And his city clerk worked for him, but he was on vacation one week. While he was gone, the city clerk decided to have, she called it office cleaning day. And he had a box with all of his flood maps and all his floodplain records in it. It was a cardboard box in a closet in his office. She took that cardboard box and she walked around the office. Does anybody know what this is? Well, nobody else knew what it was. Since nobody else claimed that box and nobody said they knew what it was, she threw the box away. The box had all her flood maps in it, all her permit records, everything. Then that community got audited by FEMA and had no paperwork to show FEMA for the audit. Now, Mother Nature doesn't read flood maps. And the best case example I can give you of that in the state of Kansas is Coffeyville, Kansas. And in 2007, they had a flood in Coffeyville, Kansas. And we use this term 1% annual chance flood. On this picture, it'd be called the 100-year flood. Well, their flood was a 1 in 2,500 event. They have a levee. That levee has 3 foot of freeboard. That means the levee is 3 foot higher than a 1% chance flood is supposed to be. The water was 5 feet higher than the top of that levee. So Mother Nature does not read flood maps. Mother Nature does not shut the water off when it's raining and the water level gets the exact level of the 1% chance flood. This is another issue that I have with my citizens because they don't understand flood maps or floodplains. They think that if they build 10 feet outside of that floodplain line that's shown on the map, then they are magically protected, that the line on the map is a force field and that no water will ever reach them because water will never get past what's shown on the flood maps. And the fact of the matter is bigger floods do come along. In 2019, we had flash floods all over the state of Kansas. It rained a lot in the month of May. 49% of the flood insurance claims that happened were from properties that were outside the floodplain. And only 2% of the buildings in Kansas have flood insurance. Only 10% of the buildings in the actual floodplain have flood insurance. Now, every once in a while, somebody asks for a variance. I've had towns that had tornadoes. People wanted to rebuild with basements, but their homes were substantially damaged and required to be brought into compliance. I've also had people that built houses without a permit. They built without a permit, and then they said, well, it's already built. You just have to give me a variance. No, that's not how permits work. I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to say never issue a variance, but don't issue a variance without following the conditions that are spelled out for variances in your floodplain regulations. And if anybody's ever thinking of issuing a variance, you better talk to me first, and I'll probably say don't do it. But there are cases where we've done variances before. A common case where we've done variances legally and it was okay with FEMA was for agriculture buildings in broad floodplains where they had nowhere else to be. We also did a variance for a boathouse for the city of Lawrence. And I hope you understand that boathouses are dependent on water. So it had to be next to the river. You couldn't put the boathouse 10 miles inland. You had to put the boathouse next to the water. So they did a variance for that. That's called a functionally dependent use. Again, this is the Reader's Digest class today. We're not going to go over every case example for variances. Just remember, somebody comes to you and says, well, I'm going to do this in the floodplain. I'm going to build a house with a basement. You're just going to have to give me a variance. Don't fall into that trap, and call me if you have questions. This is an insurance rate table from our book, and this table's accurate for 2018. The rates are slightly different now, but in October of this year, there will be a new rating system for insurance called Risk Rating 2.0. But until October of this year, this table is a fairly accurate presentation of how flood insurance works, even though the numbers would be slightly different today. But the key thing to look at is, imagine a $150,000 house. I got the red arrow pointing to the line that says structure. And if you build it 1 foot higher than the base flood elevation, the flood insurance for the premium alone, without policy fees and so on, be $682. If you go 2 feet above, it's $392. It cuts it by $300 to just raise it up by 1 extra foot. And 1 extra foot of foundation work doesn't cost you that much compared to the savings every year. However, we got those people that say, oh, you just have to issue me a variance because I want to build a basement. So a lot of times I've been in basements and there's a window well up about where my head is. So I'm about 6 feet below ground. And if the water level is 2 feet above the ground at that point, you add the 6 and the 2 and you get 8 feet below. And if you look at the rate chart, 8 feet below back in 2018 was going to cost you $11,779 per year. And if somebody gets a variance from your city by some miracle, and they do get a basement and put it in the floodplain, that's how much they're going to pay for flood insurance every year. It's actually going to be more than that because we have new rate tables since 2018. Insurance has been going up on average about 10% per year since then. So insurance can be very expensive if you don't follow the rules. And I actually showed this rate chart to two different people when I was working in county government who wanted to build in the floodplain. I was trying to convince them to elevate. And instead of elevating their house, they decided not to even build in the floodplain period and didn't build those houses at all. So this rate chart was something I just flipped this book open, showed it to people when I'm having a discussion with them, and convinced them not to build their house in the floodplain, which wasn't where I was going. I was trying to convince them to elevate, but I took the other alternative as being just as good. So an elevation certificate is a document used to verify elevation. It's a supporting document for LOMA, but it's not a LOMA. It can prove you qualify for one, but it doesn't take your house out of the floodplain until you do the LOMA paperwork. It is used to verify compliance with things like your elevation requirement to elevate 1 foot above. You'll see that document on the elevation certificate. So it's a compliance document, LOMA document. It's also used to sell insurance because you don't know what elevation on this rate chart you're at until you look at the elevation to see how high it's elevated. This is a mock-up of an elevation certificate. We have a 3-hour class on elevation certificates. It's been recorded. It's on our training website. You can listen to it. We'll probably redo it here again next year. But if you see that there's a little section C over here that has A, B, C, D. Each one of those things corresponds to a letter in the picture and tells you where to make those measurements. I'll give you a little tip. This house has utilities in the garage and has flood openings. If it didn't have flood openings, the insurance would be rated at the bottom floor of the garage rather than the house. So the insurance would be rated down there at F instead of at A. And so that might put it 3 foot lower. And you remember the rate chart, what happens when you go too low. No rise certificate. We talked about floodways. No rise certificates don't look pretty like this. A lot of times I see them, they look like a letter signed by the engineer with their seal on them that says I've calculated it out and it won't cause a rise. But anytime they put development in the floodway, we have to say that it will not cause a rise. If you don't have certification from somebody saying that it will not cause a rise, don't approve it. We've been talking about elevating buildings. Here I've got a building elevated on fill, and I've got a building that's elevated on piers, posts, or columns. This was a crawl space. The buildings elevated in crawl space are common in cities, because if you try to elevate in a city where the houses are 30 feet apart, the guy next door is going to say you're just pushing water off onto him. If you elevate on a crawl space, the water is going to be stored underneath the crawl space because it's going to enter through flood vents. Stay inside the crawl space until the flood water recedes and then it drains back out again. You're not pushing water off onto anybody else. They'll say you will, they'll think you will, but you're not, and you can prove it. Elevating on fill is more common in the unincorporated areas where you got farmhouses that are a mile apart. You're not pushing water off on anybody else. The advantage of elevating in fill is you can get a Lomar F from FEMA. If you elevate on a raised crawl space, you can't get a Lomar F from FEMA because the foundation of the house, the crawl space part, is still down in the water. You can get a cheaper insurance rate because it's elevated, but it will always be in the floodplain. There's some general requirements for compaction. Remember, if you put fill in the floodplain, you want to have compaction. You don't want the edge of your slope too close to the building. These are some general requirements. If you're doing fill in the floodplain, 9 times out of 10, you're going to have a permit from Division of Water Resources. Talk to the engineers at DWR about what they're going to require for your floodplain fill, compaction, and survey requirements. Now, fill can sometimes make things worse. This is a little picture to illustrate it. I've never seen anything that looks like this happen in Kansas. However, I have seen subdivisions where they put in enough fill to elevate 4 whole entire houses. And then those big fancy houses were all elevated on fill. They got that approved by FEMA, but the houses downstream from them all took on water in the next flood. Now, you remember that in our definition of floodways, it said water's going to rise 1 foot and stop. Well, they caused that 1 foot of rise, and the downstream neighbors were the beneficiaries of it. Basements in the floodplain aren't a good idea. You can see arrows on the right-hand side of the screen. The arrow at the top is smaller than the arrow at the bottom. The point being that as you go deeper into the water, as the soil becomes more hydrated, the hydraulic factor of that water pushing against the foundation walls increases. So the deeper into the ground we go with our basements, the more of a problem it is. Then there's arrows pointing up from the bottom. That's called uplift force. I've never seen an entire house come up out of the ground. I have seen I've seen a concrete swimming pool float right up out of the ground about 4 inches. And I've also seen basement floors that buckled and popped in the middle like a big bubble inside of them. Then the picture over here on the other side has a basement window. And I can tell you that I've actually had citizens who showed me a YouTube video of fish swimming past the window and said, look, the window glass will keep the fish out of the basement. And I had to turn around and send them 100 YouTube videos of basement windows that had busted and let the whole basement fill up with water. Tara and I had a meeting in a town, won't tell you the name of the town, but there were some very unhappy citizens from this town that came to the meeting. They were all from the same subdivision. They didn't like our flood maps. And we had that meeting. It was in the month of May, 2019. Shortly thereafter, that subdivision, everybody had their basements flooded. There was a question earlier about manufactured homes. Hey, look at this. Finally got to it. Here's a manufactured home in the floodplain. It's elevated. It's anchored. That's how you install manufactured homes in the floodplain. I don't like dry stacked cinder blocks because they tend to fall over easier. There's a manufactured home park in Manhattan, Kansas called Redbud Estates. And in 2010, there was mobile homes floating around like bathtub toys in that place. So I don't like the dry stacked cinder blocks without a whole lot of additional anchoring. If you've cemented your cinder blocks together, reinforced it, that's fine. FEMA has an entire book on how to install manufactured homes in the floodplain. And it even has blueprints, like diagrams of how to do your anchoring techniques. There are multiple anchoring techniques. You can just flip through that book with the installer and pick one. The problem I have with manufactured homes is that HUD and licensed installers have to be licensed by HUD. And licensed installers don't read flood maps, don't get permits. They just come in and drop the mobile home off and skip town without doing anything they're supposed to do. And I'd like to take some of them to court someday, but I'm not in charge of that. All right, here's a picture of some elevated utilities. We're going to talk more about utilities in a minute. Talked about the flood vents that allow the water to enter and stay on the inside of the building. It's a little diagram of that. I've only got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to kind of talk like an auctioneer real quick. Here's the flood openings in that crawl space. They can't be more than a foot above the ground, because if you put them 3 foot above the ground, how's the water get in before it's 3 foot deep? So they got to be within a foot of the ground. Here's some utilities that are elevated, 3 common techniques. It says not recommended on one. Well, I see a lot of farmhouses in Kansas that use this method over here for their propane tank for their farmhouse, and it is anchored down, and it's not going to float away, and the propane doesn't get out when the flood water comes, and the flood doesn't get in and mix with the propane. So it's legal and it works. They just say it's not recommended. FEMA would rather see the propane tanks elevated. But since this is a legal method, I don't beef about it too much when I see farmhouses that are anchored for their propane tanks that way. I have also seen propane tanks float away. They had to close a bridge in Iowa during a bad flood in 2008 because they had over 100 propane tanks washed up against the side of the bridge and they're afraid it was going to blow up. All right, here's some utilities in a garage. I already kind of hit on this issue with having utilities in a garage and how that affects your flood insurance ratings. Here's a shed. I wish I had more time spent on this shed picture because I get tons of questions about sheds. But sheds and agriculture buildings kind of treat them the same way. They have to have openings, have to be made of floodproof materials. They have to be anchored. If they don't have utilities, we don't need any elevation survey, but if they have utilities, then we have to have an elevation survey to prove those utilities are above the flood level. This is an ag building. It's generally the same rules. You want to stay away from confined animal operations in the floodplain. That means I don't want any turkey poultry houses, big giant poultry houses, pig barns, that kind of stuff where animals are locked inside. Recreational vehicles have to be licensed and ready for highway use or on site for less than 180 days. And if they can't meet those requirements, then they have to have them elevated and anchored and meet the exact same requirements as a manufactured home. If you improve an older building, pre-firm buildings are grandfathered in, but if you improve one and your improvement is a substantial improvement, more than 50%, then the whole building has to be brought up to compliance with current regulations. Same thing happens if the building is destroyed or damaged in a storm. If it's damaged more than 50%, when you repair it, you're doing an improvement to the damaged building to bring it back up to where it was, and it would also have to be brought into compliance. Here's a little slide about non-substantial improvements, but again, I got 3 minutes left, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time about this, but a non-substantial improvement might be redoing the kitchen or installing an outside central air unit when you only had a furnace and a window air unit before. So things like that. I'm kind of going fast here. This is a great book, Substantial Improvement, Substantial Damage Desk Reference. You can order this book for free from FEMA. You can also download it off FEMA's website. I actually send out pages of this book to people who ask me about it because it answers a lot of questions when somebody's doing a lateral addition or has damage to deal with. There is a tool. FEMA has a tool for doing substantial damage determinations after disaster. And a disaster does not have to be a tornado. You could have one house with one fire, and you could use this tool to determine if that house has to be brought up to code or not. It spits out a nice little spreadsheet that you can share with the property owner to prove how the damage estimations were done. To pay for bringing these things up to compliance, if you have flood insurance, there's a program called Increased Cost of Compliance that can help you with that, but it only kicks in if the damage was from a flood, and it would pay for floodproofing, relocation, elevation, or demolition. But you have to have flood insurance to get it, and it only works if your damage was from a flood because it's part of your flood policy. We do buyouts for properties here in Kansas. This is some information about that. If you have a flood-prone property and a person wants to get out, read this page and give me a call, and I'll put you in touch with the right people at Kansas Division of Emergency Management. Always do permits. I see signs like that all over Kansas. I'd love to see a sign that says floodplain permits required instead of just zoning permits. If you have an issue with a regulations issue, we actually have 2-hour class on violations enforcement and 2 1-hour parts. It's recorded. It's on our training page. You can give it a listen and you'll learn everything you want to know about notice on deeds in 1316. CRS is a great program. I've got about 40 cities in Kansas. This is a map of where some of these communities are. They're in the community rating system. They get discounts on flood insurance because the floodplain manager is doing a good job. And so if you'd like to get on that list and get the CRS program in your area, let me know and I'll work with you on it. A little deal about flood preparation and safety, and I got 1 minute left, so we're just blowing through it. Okay. I'm sorry, everybody. I ran out of time. It went faster when I rehearsed it by myself, but I kept getting interrupted. All right, so here's contact information for more information. My phone number is top of the page. I'm Steve Samuelson at steve.samuelson@ks.gov. Here's some things to watch for. Watch out for expired forms. The NFIP program is good till next September. What's going to happen with it after that? Who knows? Endangered Species Act, Risk Rating 2.0 starts in October. There are laws that regulate the waters of the United States and National Environmental Policy Act, and those things were watered down 4 years ago, but they may change now. Who knows? And thank you very much. And I'm sorry I almost went over. And we'll try to make time for questions. Okay, so I can see again.
Yeah.
Somebody, so a shed doesn't need an elevation certificate unless it has utilities. So Carol, I know you and I had a long talk about sheds and variances and things like that, but you don't need an elevation certificate on a simple shed or ag building that doesn't have utilities, because what's the elevation certificate going to verify? If it's wet flood proofed, it is going to verify it's below the BFE. We already know that. You can measure the opening sizes yourself, and elevation certificate doesn't verify anchoring. That's going to be up to the floodplain manager. What did I miss? I think
It's the only question I saw in the chat. Does anyone have any other questions?
okay, then we went 1 minute over. And if you think of a question later, you can send me an email.
All right, thanks everyone. We will get this posted on our training website so you can reference it later.
Send me a message. Send me an email if you want the training certificate. That's pretty important.
How soon would this be presented on the website?
I can probably get it uploaded there by tomorrow.
Okay, thank you.
So I know a couple of people signed off already, but if you want the training certificate for your CFM or something like that, shoot me an email and I'll get one back out to you by email. And my email is steve.samuelson@ks.gov. If you can't get me, send it to Cheyenne.